Well, good evening, and welcome to the University of Pikeville for all of our guests who are here every day. Welcome back. For those who are visiting us tonight, we're so glad that you could join us up on the hill. We want to give you a couple very critical announcements. Number one, this may be the most critical thing that I say all night to you. If you need to use the restroom tonight, immediately out these doors to my right, to your left, you're going to find bathrooms right out there. We ask that you use those restrooms tonight so that we're going to disrupt down here, coming all the way down here. Also, for respect for everyone in participation tonight of this experience, we ask that you would mute your cell phones or turn it off. I know that's kind of a hard shopping statement, but there is an off button on all cell phones, so you could use that. Anyways, in saying that, I want to welcome you to our 4th annual Carol Grizzard Browning lecture. And tomorrow night we'll be back here for part 2 of our lecture series, which we're really excited about. Once a year, the University of Pikeville takes time to dedicate and focus in on our religious heritage and tradition. We know that in the year 1889, how about try again, 1889, Presbyterians founded the school in belief that the children of the mountains deserved quality education. And now for 126 years, we've been trying to be faithful to that mission. And a part of that is religious scholarship and thinking about what does it mean to do good, both with our minds, our hearts, and our hands. So tonight is one ripple in that long stream. And because of that, the university offers many different opportunities for you to participate not only intellectually, but also spiritually. One of the new things that we'll be starting here in November, I want to give you a sneak peek about, is November 18th. Starting in the chapel, you might see some flyers hanging up all over campus. There's going to be a meditation group starting on November 18th, which we would love for you to participate in. If you're interested in meditation, come see me, and we'll talk further about how we can plug you in to that. Now, I would like to call your attention to the insert that hopefully you received tonight. And on the front side, you're going to notice that there is a beautiful woman with a stack of books. And this is Dr. Carol Grizzard Browning. Dr. Carol Grizzard Browning taught at then Pikeville College for 23 years. She preached in churches in the area. She's authored or edited many different books, which you're going to see here. Her specialty in lifelong work was looking at 1st and 2nd Samuel. In addition to the many books that she edited and articles she produced, Carol created many class materials, lecture notes, syllabi charts, handouts, and sermons, which now, in this past year, have been compiled by her husband, Dr. James Browning. Carol retired early due to some health issues. A progressive neurological disorder cut short her academic career and prevented her from bringing that career to full closure. Carol was a scholar and a teacher who created her own legacy. Carol combined wisdom with compassion, investing herself in the lives of her students. When she retired, the religion majors gave her a quilt. Included in the quilt are pieces of fabric that each student contributed. The inscription reads as following: To Carol Grizzard Browning, your fingerprints will never fade from the lives you have touched. Each person who was touched by Carol preserves her legacy as well. And I know as a person who, having not been in Carol's classroom and never having the privilege of teaching beside Carol, I still feel the imprint of Carol's legacy when I'm in the classroom, but especially when I'm out in area churches. No matter how big a smile I have, no matter how dynamic I think I am, when I leave the area Presbyterian churches, the one question they have for me is, how is Carol Grizzard Browning? Because she made such an impact on the local churches. So we come these 2 nights at 7 o'clock in honor of Carol, of her life, of compassion and scholarship. And so we're very excited for our guest tonight. On the second side, you're going to notice that we have a nice bio of our speaker tonight. And I want to kind of call your attention to what is said here in the bulletin. But also, just a side note, our speaker has come and traveled quite a long day to be here and right on time, so we're so thankful for her time. The Venerable Robina Courtin, ordained since the late 1970s, she has worked full-time since then for Lama Tubin Yeshi and Lama Zofin Rinpoche, and I just butchered those names, I'm very sorry, I apologize, for the Foundation for the Preservation of the Mahayana Tradition. Over the years, she has served as editorial director with Wisdom Publications, editor of Mandala magazine, and her books include How to Meditate, A Practical Guide, Becoming the Compassionate Buddha, and also The Bliss of Inner Fire, Heart Practice of 6 Yogas of Naropa. She has served as the executive director of Liberation Prison Project and as a touring teacher in Buddhism. Her life and work with prisoners have been featured in the documentary films Chasing Buddha and Key to Freedom. Tonight I want to show you the trailer to one of these films known as Chasing Buddha. And then, after the trailer is presented, if you would greet our guest with a warm welcome.
Well, I'm happy to be here. My first time in Pikeville, Kentucky. And I'll probably have to speak slowly. You have to speak slowly as well, I tell you. The very first time I heard a Southern American accent, I was working in London in the 60s when I was an old hippie. And I worked for this little agency, and some American was renting a car, and he said his name was Bale. And I couldn't hear it. I said, Bale? He says, as in ding dong. You're supposed to laugh. I couldn't understand. So if you have to speak, you've got to speak slowly. But I have been living in this country for quite a while, and I am an American now, so as well as an Australian. So I should be able to understand you. I'm kind of joking. So that movie was made by my nephew when he was 19 in Australia, quite a few years ago actually. And very fortunately, the prison, which is in Kentucky, we've been actually in Pikeville. I've just been there this morning. The first fellow with the beard, I've known him for that's nearly 20 years now. I've been visiting him. He's on death row. He's getting close to his death date. So on the way here, we visited him. We just driven from Pikeville, 6 hours, 7 hours. I get to see him every year. So the work I started to do in prison was when I was based in California, editing a Buddhist magazine, and I got a letter. It was about maybe a few years ago. We got a letter from this young. I was editing a magazine. I got a letter from this young Mexican-American guy from Los Angeles who was in prison in California, and he told me that he'd been in gangs since he was 11, in prison since he was 12, and then tried as an adult at the age of 16 and given 3 life sentences. So, you know, the sentencing was quite severe. He didn't kill anybody because the gang activity in Los Angeles is so intense. He's got this intense long sentence. I just saw him recently too. It's been now 25 years since he's been in prison. And just now in California, thank you, it's marvellous, they've now they're trying to find a way that when juveniles, you know, were tried as adults, see if they can get out sooner. Because the sentencing is so severe, you know. So this letter came, and I wrote a letter, wrote back, sent him a book, and within a year I had 40 people writing letters to us. And so the whole project that we ended up calling Liberation Prison Project started from there. So these people basically in prison started in California, but then it was word of mouth. And I ran that for many years, maybe 14 years. Now another colleague of mine is running it. I still have contact with many people in prison and visit prisons. But essentially what we did was, because people heard about us and wanted to read a book, you know, they'd heard about meditation, they'd heard about Buddhism, and there are these people in prison, and of course you probably know that in this country, the number of people in prisons in this country is 10 times or more than anywhere else on earth, per head of population as well as in real terms, you know. And I think, and I can say from visiting prisons in all over Australia, all over Europe, in Asia, the sentencing here is really severe. You know, I can't imagine a crime. Maybe crime here is worse, maybe not. I'm not sure. But the sentencing is extremely severe. But what's interesting for me is this is not a political statement, because people started to write to us. There were people who had these long sentences, most of them young men. You know, been in the wrong place at the wrong time, had guns, or been in gangs. Many of them had been in gangs. They were then they were sitting in these garbage dump places, because prisons aren't very pleasing. You wouldn't choose to go live in a prison. The architecture's not so nice. The food's pretty terrible. The company is sometimes not so cool. You know, and so you know, then you're bored and you want something to do. And most of them, I have to say, and I would say, over those years, we probably had contact with 25,000 people in prison, individuals. And Australia and America who wrote to us. So I would say 99% of them, working class, uneducated, had been in gangs, no family, no money. I mean, because as we all know, when you have money, you can hire the rich lawyers, and no matter how bad you've been, you can probably get out, you know. So it's kind of was really just incredible eye-opener for me. I haven't been in prisons. I haven't been sent to prison. And so for me it was very moving because ordinary human beings in the wrong, the wrong place at the wrong time, and the ones who wanted something from us were clearly like really the wackos and the psychos, you know. They wouldn't write to us, they didn't want to learn to meditate, but it was the human beings who wanted to do something with themselves. They couldn't get out of prison, so they wanted to educate themselves. I mean, many of these guys have no education. And so this young man, Arturo, who was 16 when he first went to adult prison, he's now 42, 41 or something. I saw him recently as well. And he had no education. He was in gangs since he was 11. So when you're sitting in your cell 23 hours a day in these top security cells, in the prison he was in California, initially it was against human rights, where you'd be in your cell 23 hours a day, with just you were allowed to have 10 books. No hard back because you can whack your cellmate. The inside of a pen, you can't have the hard part because you can stab your cellmate. It was really severe, you know, very severe. The noise was unbelievable. As they said to me, it was like being in a rock concert all day. And there you are with nothing else to do. You either go crazy or you start to work on yourself. You don't have much choice, you know, you can't get out. There's nothing to do. And so this is why he wrote to us, and then the people who then did write to us. And so, of course, because we're Buddhist, they wrote for Buddhist things. They didn't have to be a Buddhist. So the key thing for me, you know, I'm a Buddhist, and maybe I'll talk about what Buddhists think if you want. But the key thing is I didn't want to convert people. One of the things in Buddhism, you know, it's sort of considered really inappropriate to try and convert people. That's not the thing at all. If no one asks you what you think, you would never say it, you know. I mean, I would say in my family, I've got 6 siblings. I've been a Buddhist now for more than half my life. I could probably count 5 conversations we've ever had because they don't ask me. We all love each other for who we are, but we don't talk about it, so I don't say anything, you know. Why should I? You know yourself, you're not interested in something. There's nothing worse than somebody else shoving it down your throat, you know. So these people who would write to us, they wanted what we had, so we would send books. So for me, the key thing, and this is, I suppose, the essence of the Buddhist approach, the key thing I wanted to give to human beings was tools to help them know their own mind and develop their qualities. If they ended up becoming a Buddhist, or I don't care, you know, that's not my business. But the key thing I would say, being a Buddhist, is to know your mind. So Buddhism is interesting, I'll maybe mention this briefly. Buddhism doesn't happen to talk about a soul, but Buddhism uses the word mind or consciousness, and they're referring not just to your thoughts, but your feelings, your emotions, your unconscious, your subconscious, this entire spectrum of your inner being. And with being a Buddhist, the key thing is to become very familiar with the workings of yourself, so you can learn to lessen the neuroses and the misery and the anger and the fears and the jealousy, which is the stuff that we know causes us suffering and what causes us to make a mess of our lives, on the one side, and then on the other side, we become more qualified to then be of benefit to others, because we all live in the same boat in this crazy world, don't we, you know? So the Buddhist spiritual approach is surely all about compassion, like any good human being. It's about helping others. The Buddhist idea is you've got to kind of put yourself together first. Because if you're caught up in your own misery, your own self-centeredness, your own depression, your own anger, your own hurt, you can't help a dog, you know. So there's this nice analogy in Buddhism that a bird needs 2 wings, wisdom and compassion. And you could say the compassion wing is the point. That's where you put your money where your mouth is. That's where you help others. But the wisdom wing is where you get to know yourself well and you put yourself together. Not in a self-centered way, but in a practical way. And that basically means, in simple sense, learning to know your own misery and your anger and your depression and your jealousy, and learning to take responsibility for it, because life is tough. Bad things happen to us, there's no question. And I can see this among my friends in prison. You know, these days there's a lot of talk about people on death row who are being accused inappropriately, people being in prison for 25 years, and you know, the DNA evidence is proving that they're innocent. So, you know, you can't imagine that kind of suffering. So, learning to deal, because you can't, you know, there's a saying in Buddhism, if you can change something, please change it. But if you can't, then what do? What choice have you got? You know, to work on yourself. And the whole Buddhist approach, and the thing is, Buddhism doesn't own this idea. We can all see it's true. It's just that it's very hard. Because, you know, if the situation you're in, the lousy relationship, the lousy school, the lousy family, the lousy job, it's easy for us to get completely caught up to blame other people and feel hopeless. But if we can leave the job or leave the relationship, great, and then fantastic, but sometimes we can't. And that's clearly the situation with people in prison. They have got the luxury of walking out, you know? And many of them, especially on death row, not to mention life sentences, or even long sentences. And so it's natural in prison that many people get very depressed, they kill each other, they kill themselves. But the tools that, you know, over the years we've been trying to give people who wrote to us, with these Buddhist tools that talks about learning to know your own mind. So for me, you know, this man I met that came sort of day, Eddie, the guy with the beard, the first one, he's on death row. He was, you know, the other guy after that, one of his friends, they're both there together. I think they've been there 30 years, because that's how long appeals take when you're on death row. They were dealing drugs. I mean, they weren't such evil people. You know, they had wives and kids. They were dealing drugs, and there were guns. When you have guns, people die, you know. So 3 people died, and so they're on death row as a result. And so, of course, the shock at the beginning, and then they learned to put themselves together. And Mitch became a Buddhist over those years, you know. And so I can say with certainty, this fellow, he's 50-something now, he's a grandfather, he lives a really good life. He's content with himself, he's happy. I mean, we spent 2 hours together, we just cracked jokes the whole time, you know. Even though he's on death row, it sounds shocking to us. Because he's accepted his reality, he knows he can't change it. He's waiting for his death date to come. As he said, Robina, I'm ready for that electric jolt. You know, today also he said, I've decided with the best attitude to have when they execute me, and I think already he's working on that now, to have compassion for the people who have to kill him, you know, so I don't get angry. So this kind of thing. And this is what I find very moving about people. When you're in a situation that you can't change, that's when either the worst or the best of us comes out, isn't it, you know? So I see with him, he's really done a great job with his life. He takes care of his, you know, his nephews and nieces and grandchildren, his mother, his father, his wife. He does drawings, he writes poetry, and he takes care of his 30 inmates, his friends on death row, where they all live there together. You know, he takes care of each one of them. Some guy he talked about today who's quite psychotic. He can't do much to help him, so he's kind to him, and then he maybe go do some prayers for him. You know? So somehow I find great admiration for people I've known over these years, who are in a situation due to something they did wrong, but have been able to turn their lives around, but also not to spend all their time trying to get out of prison. Even if you're innocent, you can really go mad sometimes. I remember reading years ago about one woman in Florida who was hitching with her husband and their 3 kids. And then they got picked up by 2 guys, and then the cops stopped the guys, and then the guys killed the cops, but blamed the others, blamed the husband and wife. So then they were on death row in Florida, you know. And the husband even gets executed. I mean, can you imagine the nightmare of this? You'd go completely crazy. And she was this remarkable, she lost her kids, the husband got executed. She was there for 17 years, and eventually she got out because she was innocent. And she said at some point, you can only imagine the process she had to go through, the internal process. She said, I realized I couldn't change anything, but they could not take my mind from me. So I decided, I'm not a prisoner, I'm a monk. I'm not in a cell, I'm in a cave. So this is really quite profound, you know. And if we look into our own lives and someone accuses you, even the smallest thing that you didn't do, look at the torture, look at the suffering. Sometimes we can never let go of it, we can never forgive. We kind of completely go crazy. So you can only imagine being accused of murder and you're on death row and you're innocent. 17 years, you know. But she realized she could be changed. And this is so unusual, but many of the people I know like this. Instead of constantly being miserable, constantly suffering, constantly angry, constantly depressed, because they cannot change their situation. And this is the point. This is, as I'm saying, this we all understand it. It's not as if the Buddha owns this view, but it happens to be the key point in Buddhism. To know your mind and change it. To change the way you think. To change the way you interpret things. And it's kind of, life is a minefield. We know life is very difficult. And of course the Buddhist approach would say the key reason we find this job so hard is because we're kind of addicted to the idea that my happiness comes from out there and my suffering comes from out there. So we're always looking for the nice people, the nice job, the nice handbag, the nice meal, the nice event, the nice music, because we're convinced when we get that, then we'll get happy. And then of course as soon as you lose that, then we think that I'll get suffering. So the Buddhist approach is totally focusing only on that. You know, you're left empty because you can't guarantee. We all know that from our lives. Whether we're 15 or 95, we know we can't guarantee we'll get everything we want all the time. Things change. People stop liking us. Husbands divorce us. You know, bosses fire us. We can see life is like this. And so only focusing on the outside. And in Buddhist view, this is not some kind of moralistic thing, like you're not allowed to have money and fun. You know, of course, much money and fun as you like. But the whole Buddhist idea is totally focusing only on that as if that's the main cause of your happiness. You've got to be in trouble. Because when you don't get what you want, or when you get what you don't want, then you're left with the misery in the mind, you know. And this is my example of my friends in prison. I have such admiration for them. I mean, these are the teachings I give them, and they're the ones who really put it into practice. You know, when I go off to Starbucks and order my coffee and it's not quite hot enough, and I complain, you know, my God, excuse me. So they're great examples for me, you know. I can say anything. Chat away here, or you can start asking me questions. I don't know how we do this, you know. I think it's good to ask me some questions and I can see where to go. We can start talking whatever you like. So I have no expectation about what to say or do or anything. Yeah?
What brought you to Buddhism?
Okay, thank you. Well, I was brought up a Catholic in Melbourne, in Australia. 7 kids in the family, and it was from the very beginning. I was very devoted. I loved God. I was a total Catholic. Wanted to be when I first went to Mass, I decided I'd be a priest. And I announced it to the family. Well, of course, they all laughed and said, you can't be a priest, you're not a boy, you know. So they said, you have to be a nun. So I figured. So it was interesting in my childhood. I was very rebellious and always the worst kid at school and the worst kid at home. But at the same time, I always think about the meaning of God, the meaning of life, what is happiness, what is suffering, these kind of things. I didn't talk about it much. My other sisters didn't think about it. But it was always it was a big part of my life, you know, reading about these things. But at the same time, also very naughty, you know. So I think when I was about 13 or 12, I begged my mother to let me be a nun, like one of these holy saints, you know. She wouldn't let me, of course. So I cried. And then 20 years later, when I became a Buddhist nun, she cried. And I said to her, oh, Mum, it's all the same. And she said, well, it's all the same, why don't you change? Which is a pretty logical statement, I couldn't say anything. Anyway, the process for me, I think, without trying to sound all noble about it, I always think what interested me, ever since I was a kid, was the meaning of life, this kind of thing. Why happiness? Why suffering? Why is there good? Why is there bad? It's just how my mind was, you know. So at first I was Catholic, and then when I was 19, and sort of around the 60s, the hippie time. So I decided, okay, by God, hello boys. So it was lots of sex and drugs and jazz. When I was 15, a very powerful experience for me when I was 15. This is in Melbourne, Australia. You know, this quiet little kind of city. This is like the 1950s. I've never seen any other cultures. I've never seen any other races except, you know, white Christians. I didn't even meet a Jew. Just nice white Christian people in my country, you know. And so I remember heard for the first time, some jazz, black American music. And it kind of blew my mind, opened me up to the whole new world, you know. I remember it was a Billie Holiday record. It was this 7-inch LP, and I said to myself, why do we hear this, you know? But I kind of felt compelled to buy it. And from there, I think my religious aspirations started becoming kind of more social, about the suffering in the world, and why is there suffering, what is, you know, this kind of business. And then I got to 19, that was hippie time, so it was, oh my God, hello boys. And then I went to London and Europe in the 60s. That was sort of, I think I was ripe and ready for revolution around that time. So very radical politics, demonstrations and everything. And then very strongly also supporting, at the time of all especially the time of the States, for some reason I was very involved then with people in prison. This is before I became a Buddhist. This is 40 years before I became a Buddhist. And I was working supporting different people supporting the Black Panthers in America. I was always radical, you know. And so radical lefty for a while, kind of, and then black politics, and then feminist politics. I was a very strong feminist. And by that point, I think, I don't know, kind of, when I was a Catholic, all the non-Catholics were the problem. And then when I became hippie, all the straight people were the problem. And then I became kind of into radical left politics, all the rich people were the problem. And then I was into sort of black politics, all the white people were the problem. When I got to female politics, all the male people were the problem. So I think by that point I'd exhausted all options. Who caused the problems in the world? And then I bumped into these Buddhists, and they told me I should look at myself. Well, that was a brand new idea. I never thought of looking at myself and knowing my own mind, you know. So I've been doing that ever since. Trying to, so it's a bit of evolution. Does it make sense what I'm saying?
It makes sense.
Yes.
Recently, as I understand, you mentioned human. Isn't it true that the Dalai Lama stated that on his passing, he would be perfectly comfortable with a woman becoming a Dalai Lama?
Yeah, I think yes, for sure. The way they talk about it is that, you know, whatever's most beneficial. Whatever works, you know. Yeah, for sure. No problem. I mean, Buddhism has come from a very patriarchal society. In Asia, you know, it was very patriarchal. But I think it adjusts to the society. So clearly in our society, things are quite different. Yeah. Come on, you people. If you ask me a question, I know what you want to hear. Maybe I'll bore you to tears, so I don't want to do that. So ask me anything you like. Any old question, I don't mind. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Well, I didn't, you know, technically I didn't choose it. You kind of just, I went to this particular course, and that's what I felt I'd found what I wanted, and so I've been that ever since. But if I analyse it since then, I think it's the emphasis on this. I like this analogy of the bird needs two wings. You've got to, you know, the cliched idea, I think, in the world about being a Buddhist, you kind of sit there watching your navel, you know, you walk slowly and you be mindful. Well, it's a bit of a cliche, really. It's quite a cliche, really. The job is to know yourself well. And that's what they mean by developing wisdom. Because when you lessen your anger and your fears and your neuroses and your jealousy and your depression, then you get more clear, and then you can adapt and see other people more clearly, which means you can now do the second one, the compassion wing, which is help others. And that just suits my nature, you know, in this life. I'm into action and doing things, you know, it just suits me. So, you know, it suits me, it just suits my nature. And it's the emphasis on helping others. Which is, yeah. Does that make sense? Okay. What else, people? Yes?
Couldn't you say that anybody can be a Buddhist? I mean, it's not really a specific religion, it's just an approach to how you try to...
Yeah, I understand, exactly. You could say, the way to put it, I think, because strictly speaking, it's not what we would call a belief system. So you tell me if you disagree with this, but this is my own view. When I was a Catholic, clearly I have faith in God. God is a superior being who is the creator of me, the creator of the universe. And also, by definition, I remember asking a Jesuit priest friend of mine, I said, by definition, what is a sin? He said, by definition, it's doing what God said you shouldn't do. So naturally, if I do something wrong, it's because God said, so that I should ask forgiveness. And that's our view, isn't it? Pretty much our view. If you're a Muslim, if you're a Christian, if you're a Catholic, whatever, it's the creator, he's the source of the universe and the source of you, broadly speaking, isn't it? Well, the Buddhist view is not like that at all. So Buddha, you know, is this, you could say, was this regular guy who actually came out of this pretty incredible Indian tradition, which is pretty, I think most of us in the West don't know much about the Indian. Why would we? It's not our culture. But these amazing Indians, more than 3,000 years ago, before Buddha, he came out of that tradition. They were, they were the ones really who cultivated, cultivated this particular meditation technique that these days is known as, broadly speaking, is known as mindfulness, which is the kind of the idea of what people think of as meditation. You close your eyes, you sit a certain way, and what you're really doing, this technique that these amazing Indians developed, was it's actually this really refined, disciplined, psychological technique that enables you to go to a subtler, more refined level of your own mind, which I think in our psychological models is not even posited as existing. And not just a space out there, so that you can learn to completely change the mind, stop all the craziness and the uncontrolled thoughts and feelings and emotions. And it's a really sophisticated skill when you've accomplished it that enables you to see your own mind at the deepest level and to really fundamentally change it and to get rid of all the rubbish, all the nonsense, all the emotional confusions and the fears and the dramas. So this is really where Buddha came out of this, from this tradition. So he diverged in his own direction, in relationship to particular points. But the whole point of it all was to learn to understand the very nature of who we are, you know. It's really like internally understanding what is a human being, what is negativity, what is positive, what is happiness, what is suffering. And that's the stuff that Buddhism deals with, the internal part. And on the basis of accomplishing your own nirvana, as they call it, which is just this word that really you use to refer to your own mind at this subtle level, when you've done the job and you're radically changing yourself. You understand? And so technically you can say anyone can do that. You know, you don't need to, and it's not a question of believing in it. I mean, belief, I know as a Catholic, belief plays a huge role. Because, you know, it would be considered the worst rudeness, I think, to try and prove God to be right. Isn't that true? Are some of you people Christian? No answers. Are some of you people Christian? So it would be considered extremely arrogant to prove God right or wrong. Would that be right? You have faith in God, don't you? Because necessarily you can't prove what God says to be true. Is that right or not? Is that right? And I see that amazing good in that. I think that's fantastic. That just happens not to be the Buddha's view. The Buddha says he, you know, through this process that he went through, he's basically what Buddhism is laying down Buddha's own methodology of how he got to this certain stage of inner development. And he basically said, now it's up to you. If you want to do this, you can achieve it as well. So doing this process that he went through is the point, you know. It's not so much believing in it, but doing it. The Buddhism even uses the term superior being, but not in the way that Christians do. So there's many kind of, you could say there are many similar findings, but some fundamentally different views. So the other point, of course, is you don't need to be 100% Buddhist. You can be 1% Buddhist. You can take, I mean, I remember 3 years ago, one of the Catholic nuns, who was of the same order of nuns who educated me, she wanted me to put her into a meditation retreat for 2 weeks. So I gave her these different Buddhist books to read, all about the mind, and she said it increased her own faith. You know, she used these tools to help enhance her own practice. And I've seen that. And the Dalai Lama, for example, he has many wonderful conversations. Some of his dearest friends are Christians and people and they have really good communication with each other. So in many ways you can say that there are tools in Buddhism, of course, that anyone can use if they choose. From the big picture point of view, which is also my interest, Buddhism, basically, like Christianity, is an entire world view. This is where the whole idea of karma comes in, which is a huge one from the Buddhist view. But basically, Buddha says our consciousness goes back and back and back. No one creates us, and our own actions themselves, second by second, kind of program our own mind that produce our own suffering and own happiness, not just in this life, but from life to life. So the whole that bigger picture that's studied in great depth in all the Buddhist literature, many people might be interested in that. You understand? But the techniques of understanding the mind and meditation, they're open to anybody. So it's up to one. You know, often I say you can be a 1% Buddhist, and it's a question of taking the tools that work for you. You don't have to jump in the deep end. You know, it happens to be for me. I want the big picture. I like that big picture, and that's the one I'm working with. You know, in my life. Does that make sense? Yeah. Anybody else? Yes.
What about in all these years of experience in prisons?
Yes.
You go in and they ask you questions and all this. What have they taught you? What have you learned from them?
Oh, what I've learned from them is just immense. The main point, as I mentioned before, you know, when, you know, there they are in these garbage dumps. For whatever reason, I'm not saying they're innocent victims, I'm not saying that. But there you are in these places where everything is not pleasant. The environment is ugly most of the time. The food is disgusting. The company isn't the best. You know, you're treated like an animal. Mostly it's a very strong view if you're in prison, especially if you kill people, you're on death row. If you've been a gangster, you're seen as like an animal. You're treated often in the prisons. I mean, I'm almost shocked sometimes how badly people in prison are seen, you know. And there's a very strong feeling that once you're a criminal, you're always a criminal. You understand? So for me, I found it very moving, these human beings who wrote to us, who wanted something, and I was happy to give them the tools. And then, of course, one of the big tools we had was, the main program we had was the people who write to us. So it's very hard to go to prison. The country's pretty big and there are so many prisons in this country. And then what you do is you go back next month and then you move to another prison. So what we've established is a system of mentors. So we had a couple of hundred people around the world. So people would write. We'd give them to one of the mentors. We'd send them books and they would write to each other. And that was really marvelous, because what I found that many of these people had no friends, no family, no one. So they had one human being you could write to and just help you in whatever way you wanted. Some wanted serious Buddhism, some a good friend. It was a very marvelous thing that we could offer. So for me, what I found was this is the courage of a person living in a garbage dump where you can't have any freedom to even pick your nose in peace, where you're seen as an animal, the food is disgusting, everything is disgusting, but you're able to really put into practice these things that I say I'm supposed to be teaching. And they're showing me, I mean, it really has been very comforting for me. You know, how easily we get upset when the slightest thing is wrong, how easily you're offended when people insult you, or your coffee isn't the nicest possible, or the temperature isn't right. Whereas in these places, you just have no freedom. You either go mad, or you completely find a way to find your own way in it to be happy, and to use the tools that you've got to transform your mind, but you can't transform anything else. That for me has been the most moving, because that's exactly what they're the tools I give them, so it's really humbling when I see them truly put it into practice. I'm not trying to say they're all saints, I'm not saying that. But the ones who really do, when I meet my friend today, Mitch, you know, there he is in his red jumpsuit, he lives in his red jumpsuit. Everywhere he goes, he has to be escorted. He's hardly had any possessions, but he's learned to really find a worthwhile life. He helps all the guys on death row who spend most of their time in their cells, completely depressed, just watching television, totally wasting their lives, completely depressed, living on drugs and pills, you know. Whereas he's found a way to be truly helpful. You know, it's very inspiring. When you've got so little freedom, but to really find some freedom. It's not a cliche. It's an internal freedom. That's the thing for me, most of the thing. So it inspires me to be more authentic in doing the things that I say to them, you know, to do it myself. Do you understand? Yes.
So, describe for me the afterlife that might be involved with Buddhism. You know, Christianity.
Yes.
Also, big time. And where's this all?
I understand. Well, yeah, in this way, the Buddhist view is very, very different. Okay, I'll tell you. So the Buddhist view would be that, what's your name?
My name? Daryl.
Daryl. Okay, here's Daryl, okay? It's very different, you'll see, very different view. You did ask me, so I'll tell you. The Buddhist view is that your mind, your consciousness, they use these words synonymously, not physical. They don't talk about a soul, but you can effectively talk about a subtler level of your mind is like that. So your gross consciousness is your anger, your jealousy, your love, your kindness, your sensory. And then you've got a subtler level of consciousness. And then at the time of death, Daryl's consciousness, kind of basically programmed by the way he lived his life, then will be sort of, it's a highly complex process, but that consciousness will leave this body. And then depending on the programming, and that's really, that's the way they talk about karma. Karma just means everything you think and do and say leaves seeds in your mind that will produce fruits like that in the future. It's a highly complex process. But the crucial point in Buddhism, there's nobody who's judging or rewarding. The Buddha would say this is a natural law that occurs in every mind, every dog, every human, every sentient being. Every being is driven by, programmed by their own thoughts, their own feelings, their own verbal and physical actions. And all that stuff kind of programs them. That's the best way to say it. So that when you die, your consciousness will leave the body and it will take another rebirth. And it's all just kind of, it's a natural law, he says. And that type of rebirth will be depending on whether you know, the virtuous or the non-virtuous seeds were most prevalent. So in general, the Buddhist view would be virtuous actions, patience, loving, kind, forgiving, non-killing, non-stealing, non-harming, a very conscious, intentional way to live your life like that as a good person. That programs your mind with virtuous imprints, so that will bring happy results. For Buddha, it's a natural law that virtue produces happiness and non-virtue produces suffering. And like I said, it's not a moralistic thing. You're not getting punished or rewarded because Buddha doesn't assert something like that. He says it's a natural law that occurs in every mind, every second. So that's why he says we need to be in touch with our mind so we can be in charge of this process and stop us being a victim and feel everybody else is the cause of our happiness, everybody else is the cause of our suffering. And so the Buddha would say we've got this potential to rid the mind totally of all the ego, all the neuroses, all the fears, all the jealousy, all the anger, which he says is the cause of our suffering and the cause of why we harm others. I mean, look at the world, you know. So the process, the internal process is learning through these meditation techniques to, as one of my teachers says, to be your own therapist, but in a very conscious way, unpacking and unraveling the contents of your own mind, ridding the mind of all the rubbish, all the fears, all the nonsense, fully developing all the goodness, so that eventually you become what they call a fully enlightened being, who then is able to manifest in different bodies throughout universes to help people. That's kind of in essence. Makes sense?
So everybody should be getting better.
Well, no, only if you make the, only if we do the job. If we do the job, you know. If we do the job of conscious, the very first level of practice, just like in any person, is refrain from killing, lying, stealing, and you train your mind in that habit. You know, you live in vows of morality, and then you start to know your mind more, and then you practice compassion wing, and you keep on moving life after life until eventually you've perfected this process. And then you're effortlessly able to manifest around the world benefiting others. That's what they talk about. I remember one time, it was very interesting, in Kathmandu at our centre there, in Nepal, one group of Lutherans came and wanted to have a talk about Buddhism. They came to Kathmandu, so I talked about Buddhism. And we was discussing this view about you get reborn and help others. I remember one of the guys, he was very funny, he said, "Oh God, that sounds terrible. I don't want that," he said. He said, "I want to go to heaven with God when I die, thank you very much." So kind of, you can see it's quite different. Many similarities, but quite different view, you know. Does that make sense? Darryl? Does that make sense?
Yes.
Right. You pick one, anything. I don't. Why did you come to hear me? What did you want to hear from me? I have to know what you want to hear from me. Come on, you guys, talk to me. Any old question? I don't mind. Go on. Yes.
What was one of the hardest transitions that there was from Christianity to Buddhism?
For me, well, it was an evolution. Like I said, it was Christianity, hippie, radical left, white, black politics, feminist politics, Buddhism. So it was an evolution. So for me, it sounds cute, it sounds funny the way I put it, but I know in my own constant wish to try to understand the world, and I didn't go to the scientific method. I went sort of more the political method. You understand? Trying to understand why the world was suffering. So I went through these different phases of trying to find, really, very consciously, trying to find why there was suffering. Where were the causes of suffering? You understand? So for me, it was an evolution. It wasn't a big leap from one to the other. Do you understand? Does it make sense? Yeah. Very strongly, that was for me. It sounds like different things, but for me, it was a very clear, obvious internal progress that I made. Yeah. Yes, what else?
So here's the big question: we share this comment. How do we alleviate suffering? What
Okay.
do we do?
Okay, thank you. That's a perfect question, isn't it? Well, this is the Buddhist view. This is where now it sounds quite intense. We can see the world full of, I mean, even if we don't think of other creatures, but as I say, we can include the ones we see, which is also including the humans and the worms and the kangaroos and the dogs and the fish. For the Buddha, the term that he uses is, for all these beings, is the word sentient being. And it's interesting, the translation of the Tibetan word is mind possessor. So the Buddha's deal is that there are trillions of mind possessors. And he would assert sentient beings, not just humans and worms and fish, but also ones that are equivalent to the Christians, the occupants of a heaven. You know, he would call them God realm, not God in the sense of creator, but highly, subtle beings who are living in bliss with light bodies. They're called God beings. And then there are humans, then there are animals, then there are beings that are called spirits who are very intensely suffering. And then there are beings called the hell realms. So in many ways, I've over the centuries of different religions, there seems to be many similar observations, but obviously very different interpretations. You understand? And that, I find, that's why for me, I would never criticise any religion. I find it amazing that human beings over the centuries have used their common sense and their intelligence to investigate the meaning of life. I have great respect, So the Buddhist observation, Buddhist view, is that there's all trillions of sentient beings, and every one of them, necessarily their consciousness, or their mind, or their consciousness. We're not talking the brain here, we're talking your experiential level of thoughts, feelings, emotions, unconscious, like I said before. This consciousness, think of it as like a river of mental moments. This moment of my consciousness, we can track it back, couldn't we? An unbroken chain of mental moments, right back to the first second of conception in my mother's womb. So the Buddha would say, okay, the materialist would say you're just the egg and sperm, mummy and daddy made you. If you're a Christian, God put the soul there, and the Muslims would say the same. The Buddhist view would say, neither of those. Yes, your parents give you a body, how kind of them. But they didn't make you. They provided the means for your consciousness from before in that continuity, from a previous life, not more than a few weeks before, okay? To go into that womb. So the Buddhist view is this is happening for all sentient beings, and what drives that process is not a creator. It's not a random process, and it's not driven by somebody. It's this, like I said before to Darryl, it's this natural process of cause and effect. That every one of those minds, every second, by what they're doing and thinking and experiencing, program their mind that will produce their future experiences. So then suffering experiences, the Buddha would say, are the fruit of past negativity created by that consciousness in who knows what life, it could be 1,000 lives ago. What we call happiness, every moment of it, whether it's just getting a nice cake, someone smiling at you, or if it's the suffering of someone being mean to you, whatever the experience is, from the grossest to the most simple to the most complex, the Buddha would say this natural law of karma it's the fruit of seeds or tendencies you put into your mind in the past. And we're all in the same boat. And that one life we're the one who does the harm, next life we're the victim of the same kind of harm. One life we do the virtuous one, next life we receive the result of that virtue. And he says we're doing this countless life after life after life. That's what he would say. So the way to alleviate suffering, it has to start with you. To recognize, the Buddhist view would be, you first take on board, you recognize your suffering. And then you've got to be sick of suffering. And then he would say the main causes of your suffering, Robina, you can't blame Fred or the next door neighbour, you certainly wouldn't blame God, unless you're Italian. Apparently Italians are very rude about God. Apparently. Anyway, we love to blame mum and dad, you know, we love to blame someone else. The Buddhist idea is not blame. There's no heavy moral overtone there. It's responsible. So when we can be accountable, and I realise that my suffering, which means the bad things that happen to me, which also means my own ridiculous tendencies, my tendency to be angry, jealous, this is my own stuff that I came programmed with. So by owning responsibility for it in a very kind of adult way, not in a blame, guilty way, I realise, you know what, I'm up to here with suffering, I'm fed up with this, I'm going to change. The head of population of far more Buddhists and far more interested in Buddhism in Australia than say in this country. Then in Europe, most of Europe, and a lot of Europe. So maybe the interest in the West has coincided with, I'd say very much, strongly coincided with the exile of the Dalai Lama from Tibet. I don't know if you know the history of Tibet, but Buddhism had been there about the 8th century. And because they're so isolated, right out on the other side of Mount Everest, and also politically, they wanted to be isolated. So not many people would go there. Apparently the Jesuits went there and they even translated all the Bible into Tibetan. They couldn't get it into Tibetan, so they launched Christians in Tibet. A few Muslims apparently, because the Jesuits had no success at all in Tibet. They were having this. Anyway, Buddhism was there in the 8th century, from the 8th century. And I'd say before 1959, when the Chinese, when there was finally an uprising against the Chinese communists, because the Chinese, like a lot of other parts of China, basically co-opted Tibet and said it was part of their country, which is a big legal issue now, 60 years later. So, the beginning, the Chinese came in at about 1950. And up until that time, there was almost nowhere, a few Westerners would go to Tibet if you read the histories. You know, but basically they still remained completely isolated. And I would say, up to that time, 99% of Tibetans were Buddhist. And I would say, there were 6 million people, probably 1 million. 1 million of the 6 million were monastic, monks or nuns. Monasteries were completely pervasive throughout the country. And there was, you know, so within Buddhism, in the world, there's two main strands, if you like. One is called Hinayana Buddhism, or sometimes Theravada Buddhism. So if we use this analogy of the 2 wings of the bird, all this inner work we're talking about here, learning to meditate, know your own mind, you live in vows of morality, you don't kill, you don't lie, you don't steal, this kind of whole approach to spiritual practice. That's the wisdom wing. The Buddha would say from doing that kind of work, you eventually achieve your own liberation. You quit suffering, you get rid of all the delusions, you go beyond ego, and you achieve your nirvana, as they call it. It's not equivalent to heaven. It's a state of being. And once you achieve that, you don't need to get reborn again in the cycle of rebirth. Buddha says you get reborn again and again in different types of realms of existence, animals, humans, etc. So once you quit that, you've seen reality, you've removed these neuroses from your mind, you've quit ego, you've developed all your goodness, and then you're finished. Well, that's the Theravada Hinayana path. That's the Buddhism that's taught in Thailand, Burma, a few countries like that. And then you've got the next kind of, you've got the compassion wing, which is often we read the term the Bodhisattva path. Well, the word Buddha is a Sanskrit word. It means Buddha. Sorry, it is a Sanskrit word. But the Tibetan equivalent is the term Sangye. And then the etymology of that word is very interesting. The first syllable, Sang, implies the total eradication from our consciousness, from our being, our mind, all delusions, all neuroses, all ego, all negative states. This is what Buddha has found to be possible. And then the other syllable, Sangye, that implies the complete development of all the goodness, the love, the compassion, the empathy with others, the connectedness with others. And that's the two wings of the bird, wisdom and compassion. So the Mahayana Buddhism, the Bodhisattva path, Bodhisattva is an awakening person, a person who's heading towards becoming a Buddha. Often a Buddha is known as an awakened person. So the Bodhisattva path, as they call it, or the Mahayana path, the great vehicle, is when you've got the two wings of the bird. You do the wisdom wing, and then you don't not just come back. You want to come back again and again out of compassion to help others. That's the attitude. So that Tibetan Buddhism in Japan to some extent, Buddhism in Taiwan, China to some extent, is from that tradition. And then there's an added component that's really only in Tibet now. It's called the Vajrayana, the most esoteric, or the most advanced levels of practice. The Vajrayana Buddhism, they call it. Okay? That's in essence. So within Tibet, though, over the centuries, since the 8th century, like everywhere, I mean, look at the number of Christian churches now. Just even that meeting we had at lunchtime, 4 people with completely different views. I mean, I just thought, when I was a Catholic, the world was divided into Catholics and Protestants. You bunch of the Protestants, which are Catholic. Catholics are the real ones, the Protestants are the state people, isn't it? And I mean, even when I was a kid, there was one girl in our school called Mary Lou Feinberg, and they said, oh, she's Jewish. I've never met a Jewish person, I was just a Catholics. It's like a very small world. And now there are millions of variations, aren't there, Christians. So that means, and what that is, I suppose you could say, is just different ways of thinking, different ways of interpreting, isn't it? Well, in Buddhism in Tibet, you could say there are 4 main schools of thought that cultivated over the centuries, And the one that I'm part of is the same as the Dalai Lama. So what else? Other questions? Any other questions? Okay, so here we're talking about Buddha, this person called Buddha. So, I mentioned last night, and I mentioned now, the characteristics of Buddha. Like I said to you, it almost sounds like the same definition as God. Infinite wisdom, omniscient, infinite compassion, empathy, and love for others, and infinite power. I don't know, 3 essential qualities of enlightened being, of God, would you say that? I don't know, we'll define God differently. But sort of, if you think of God, I'll use Buddhist words. Does this sound like God? God is everywhere, God pervades the universe, and then God is all-knowing, all compassionate. Yeah, is that right? Is God like that? You can personify him calling Jesus, can't you, for a reason? Would that be right? But God is not manifest, not physical. Yeah, what did I say? I'm asking you. Okay, good, thank you. So that's Buddha. But the difference is, the Buddha says, we can all become that way. We can all become our own Buddha. But there's not one of them who is simply there, who didn't have a cause, didn't have a source, who is the source of everything else, who punishes and rewards and creates. Not like that. The Buddha would say those characteristics of infinite wisdom, infinite compassion, infinite power, infinite love, they are the natural potential of all consciousnesses, all sentient beings, all minds. And the one that we know about was the Buddha of 2,500 years ago. He was a regular guy who became that, became a Buddha. Now I know from a Christian point of view, That sounds like it can't be possible because God, by definition, is beyond the ordinary laws of the universe. He didn't have laws and could not possibly have been ordinary. You see my point? But I'm only saying the Buddhist approach. So that if it's true then that our beings who have become a Buddha, they're infinitely powerful, infinitely compassionate, and their only job is their lives. So we pray to Buddha. In fact, we have many manifestations of different Buddhas. They're just different kind of manifestations of different qualities of the Buddha. And they're personified, you know, like, and so prayer is a major part of our practice. You pray to the Buddha. You could sort of like, as a, you know, you would ask the doctor to help you. They've got the expertise. They've died to help you. They give you advice. They might even do something skillful that actually cure you, but really it's you who takes the medicine. It's you who takes the advice. It's you who puts it into practice. So that's our relationship with the Buddha, but infinitely wise, infinitely compassionate, who we rely upon, whose advice we rely upon, which we try to practice. And so you reach out to the Buddha, very strong devotion, very strong prayer, over maiden goal, especially spiritually. Does that make sense?
Buddha then offers us tools to deal with the cards of the West.
Exactly, because he's giving us the tools that he used for himself, that he became a Buddha with. So he's giving us what he has found working, and that's what the Buddhist is doing, is using the tools, using his methodology that he says he used to become who he is. As he put it that way, as opposed to being a creator of them. And therefore his job is also not to punish or reward. Because Buddha would say this law of karma, like we talked briefly last night, which is what Buddha says runs the universe. It doesn't have a person, no one made it up, no one's running it. It runs in every single being's lives. So the negative tendencies will cause us to do negative things, which is to harm others. And they leave tendencies in our mind, or seeds in our mind, that will run into the future as our own suffering. It's natural law that will cause suffering. It doesn't need to, it's not punishment. It just occurs naturally. Right? You eat lousy food, you get a bellyache. It's not punishment, it's just a natural consequence. And the Buddha would say that virtue and goodness, the natural consequence of that in my consciousness as it goes along, is happiness and all the qualities. You see what I'm saying? That's the Buddha thing. So there's a sense of accountability. You've got to do the job. But you rely, definitely rely on it, you rely on it. And the same way, I mean, Tibetan Buddhists, enormous amount of prayer and devotion. Huge amount. I mean, yeah, I'm on that one. Does that make sense, Darren? Right. Okay. Well, if I look at Asia, which was mainly what was Buddhist, they were completely patriarchal. I mean, you would, I mean, you know, they were really patriarchal. Men ran the show. But the Buddhist view, the Buddhist approach would be in general, everybody, male or female, has the same potential to become an enlightened being. So it's more a cultural thing. Like in Tibet, they were very patriarchal. Most of the bosses were men. Most of the ones who ran the show were men. But now that I've seen Buddhism in the West, because this is a different culture, then I would say, like for example, in the organisation of Buddhist centres that I'm part of for the last many years, there are as many women teaching as there are men. And so my teachers, basically, if they see you've got a quality, whether you're male or female, it doesn't matter. Whether you're a monk or a nun or a lay person, if you've got the quality, they'll give you the job. Because we've all got the same potential. That's pretty much the bottom line. So often it's a cultural thing. What suits a certain culture. You know, some cultures are more traditional, more patriarchal. You understand? Does that make sense? Yeah, okay, thank you. Well, this is what I like to say. I'm taking Buddhism as my religious hypothesis. And I mean that sincerely. I mean, I'm not trying to be silly when I say that. Because often, you know, if you take the view that Buddha is not a creator, and that everything that Buddha achieved himself is coming from his own experience. It's not from revelation, it's not from on high, it's from his own direct experience, and that he's laid that down. Then strictly, technically speaking, you can say Buddhism isn't a belief system. Technically it isn't. That he says everything that he has observed to be true, including reincarnation, including the law of karma, including Buddhahood, all of this is from his own experience. So strictly speaking, it's not a belief system, it's not merely believing it. You actually have to apply it. And so that's why I prefer to say I'm using this by local hypothesis, which means I take it deadly seriously. I am fully fledged Buddhist. I've been doing this for more than half my life now. And so for me, it's an ongoing, step-by-step process of listening to the teachings, understanding the philosophy, practicing, and each step of the way, if I'm being authentic, surely if I'm doing it properly, I will be experiencing and verifying each step of the way. So as the Dalai Lama often says, if you are following the steps, but you get to a point where you do discover that it's not correct, the Buddha is wrong, you must reject it. So all I can say is for myself, so far so good. Does that make sense? It was almost like saying, almost for me, I don't mean it in any cynical way. Because I think when I say it's my working hypothesis, meaning I'm prepared to fight for the wrong. I'm not being cynical about it, because I think one of our biggest problems with religion, we tend to get a bit superficially lazy, or just swallow the whole thing whole. And then we get bored and chuck it all out, you know. Or you believe whatever the big mob believes. If somebody everybody stops believing that, you've got to join the other club. So I think we often don't use much integrity in thinking. We just kind of, and I'm not putting just believing down. It ends up helping you become a better person, go for it, you know. But I think when sometimes your faith goes, many people talk about it, when your faith goes, what do you get to rely on? Okay. You just got to fall back on with understanding the teachings and being very clear about it. You see what I'm saying? We've got to be blocked down and we can use it emotions. Okay, I will, roughly. Okay. Seriously, I just recently, one of my jobs is to edit books with my teachers. So I just finished the last 5 years working on a book on Zopa, how to help your loved ones at the time of death. You know, and so the whole process, especially if you're dying slowly, you know, to help the person be ready to be provide a most conducive environment, the friends allowed to know what to do, how to help the person with their practice. There's lots of things to do to help have a really peaceful, good death, you know. And the crucial point for Buddhism, the reason to have a good death, being a peaceful, virtuous death, is because at the time of death, as they call it, I would say, the karmic seeds that will be triggered, that will cause your next rebirth. This happens before you at the time of death, so death is a really crucial time. So basically the process, they describe it, you know, as a sort of a gradual kind of deep. What's her name? Amanda. Okay. So there's Amanda. She's on her deathbed, and she's a Buddhist, okay? And she's dying slowly. That means throughout her life, she's been very aware that she's going to die. She's not really in denial of it. A lot of the Buddhist teachings are very extensive on understanding death, accepting we're going to die, understanding impermanence, so we don't get into fantasy, you know. Not because it's a fearful thing, but just because it's reality, it's part of life. So I think in the materialist world, we don't mind thinking about death, because the best you can do as a materialist, you've got to look forward to a black hole. And who wants to fall into a black hole? Nobody. So we live in denial, right? And if you're a Christian, you look forward to heaven, isn't it? I mean, if you're really devoted, if you're a Muslim, you look forward to that. So the Buddhists got a similar idea. So confronting the reality throughout your life is a crucial part. And which of course also means for a Buddhist that you want to live a good life. Not because at the end of life you get rewarded, because your own actions themselves will bring their own reward. So my mother used to say, even she was a Catholic, virtue has its own rewards. Well, that's the Buddhist idea of karma. Whatever we think and do and say, necessarily kind of leaves in our sow seeds in our mind, or we like programs in our mind. And that the negative one will ripens our suffering, and that includes suffering rebirth, or tendencies or experiences. And the virtuous one ripens happiness. That stands for fundamental kind of principle. So that drives your wish to want to practice, first for your own sake, because you see the suffering. You don't want to suffer in reverse, you don't want to have misery, you don't want to have bad relationships, you don't want to keep having anger and jealousy. So for your own sake, you want to live a good life, but also because you want to come up with so the two wings of the bird. And that compels you in your daily life. And then, of course, death will be a fine experience. So then, at the time of death, so what happens with Amanda, let's say if I'm being your helper and I'm your friend and I'm doing, you know, so you get roots in the bottom, and I do your practices for you so you can hear the prayers. I have a CD on radio because that's really helpful for the mind to calm you down. And also, the Buddha would say, everything we see and hear, especially, come leads imprints in our mind. So it's really good for you to hear the Buddhist prayers, hear your practices. that kind of helps you relax, you know. And then slowly I'll recognise at the time when the actual death process starts. And they describe it in great detail, but I'll just describe it briefly here. Because basically this person is meant to be structured. So first of all, your ability to, hold a lot of information in your mind starts to cease. Your eye consciousness starts to go. You can't hear things. And then slowly through the first few stages, as described in about 8 stages, by the time you stop breathing, you're not dead yet, not for the Buddhists, but you've kind of lost the plot. You forget who you are, you've lost, your senses have ceased, your breathing has ceased, your ability to know what's going on has ceased. And actually, sometimes you have fear. And so even probably before you stop breathing, they say, that the incarnate seed, this way they use it, is kind of triggered, that will be the one that will cause you already on autopilot to go to your next route. So if a man dies really peacefully and virtuously, then that will trigger a very virtuous seed. We're carrying around billions of karmic seeds, if you like. For everything we've said and done and thought, all programmed in our mind. So dying peacefully can encourage a very virtuous seed to be triggered, and already that's programming you to go to your next level of Buddha. That could be several weeks' time, because they talk about rebirth. Unless you're a highly realised being, you don't need to be born at all. Or if you're a highly realised being, you can choose to be born really black. You're in charge of the process. And for a regular person, just a good, nice person like you could say, unless you're a great, special meditator. So then by the time you stop breathing, you're not dead yet. That's when you get into the body day around materialist culture. And I know when my grandmother died, she was a Catholic, we live for several days, the nuns would come in and say prayers. It's very similar to the Buddhist tradition. Usually, the Tibetan tradition, you live the first 3 days and be very respectful. People would come in and rotate and do prayers and special things. You wouldn't talk, you really treat it with great respect. You keep very peaceful and very nice, So that from the time you stop breathing, in Buddhism they say now your subtle consciousness, which is the same as when you dream. It's a subtle level of conscious being. That's still in the body, and that gradually gets more subtle and more subtle, and eventually that will leave the body, and there's certain indications of when that leaves the body. They say that everything happens to the heart chakra, and if you feel above here it's still warmth there, even though the rest of your body is very cold, it means your very subtle mind is still in the body, and you will not touch the body until that goes. They say it's usually after 3 days. And then as soon as your consciousness leaves the body, you're on autopilot now, right? There's no awareness. But you're already programmed for the next life. And you go to this kind of like experience, like a dream, it's like an intermediate state. I think it's a bit similar to the Christian teachings about, what are they called? Purgatory. That's right, purgatory. There's many similarities in many religions, I'm quite sure. So it's sort of intermediate period. And it's always like you're waiting for your new mummy and daddy to pop into bed. Basically, if you're going to make human birth, And so then when your new mummy and daddy pop into bed, then you kind of, the karma ripens, and you run like a magnet. The first step of conception is when the egg and sperm come together, and that's when you zap it there, and off you go to the person. Well, then, yes, this Buddhist view, like this mentioned with Amanda, they talk about you've got gross consciousness, which is how we function day to day, our conceptuality and our sensory experiences, which is all we think of in the materialist view, isn't it? That's like when you stop breathing, that's finished. Well, that's just a gross level of consciousness, your thoughts and feelings and emotions. We all know we have a dream level, which there's no real, I don't think there's any kind of reason in psychology about dreams, it's a really strange experience, and everyone has different views. But that's also the same level of consciousness that the Buddhists would say is what's happening when you leave your body and have out-of-body experiences or near-death experiences. Okay, the Christians might call that the soul leaves the body, but the Buddhists would say it's a subtle consciousness, which is a continuity of your gross one. So most of us, we have dreams, we're not really in charge of it. When you're really an advanced practitioner, you can use your meditation to have complete control, and you can go to the subtle level, which is infinitely more powerful and more capable of doing the work of developing properties, and they can have complete control over that. They will not be ever unconscious. I mean, many of these great practitioners, like my teacher on the Zohar, he never actually becomes unconscious. He never actually goes to sleep, because he's got all these skills in meditation, where he goes to these more subtle levels, and you're able to do much more work on yourself and rid your mind at subtle levels of all nonsense, do you understand? So ordinarily you wouldn't go to sleep when you dream, right? But you can learn from your dream, because it's your consciousness, and the Buddhist view would be, and like I said before, this whole idea of karma is that every single thing any being sees or hears or experiences or thinks about none of it goes astray. I mean, even in one day, we don't remember 99% of that day, we forget all the thoughts we thought, we don't remember. But every single thing that goes on in our mind, every single of our senses, the wisdom, none of it gets lost. It gets all imprinted. And that's what often comes out in dreams. They can even be past experiences from past lives, memories of things, all this kind of chaos of our unconscious. It's all our other stuff imprinted. And the whole job is to sort all that mess out, get it all become conscious and get rid of the rubbish and go goodness. And the brain's meditating to do that. So basically, the simple way of putting it, learning about itself is what the job is. Learning to distinguish between the negative states of mind, the neuroses, the anger, the fears, all this stuff, which the Buddha says you get rid of, and learning through your own daily work, knowing your own mind more and more, to distinguish between those. So like, if I've got a boyfriend, I'm going to say James, I'm in love with James, my boyfriend. For example, the Buddha's teaching on attachment. If you read any Buddhist books, you hear about attachment. It's a massive point in Buddhism. And what attachment is done under the negative head, and it's a neurotic, I-based state of mind. It's completely like a junkie to get what I want. So that's, and that makes James look much more divine than he really is. It makes him really obsessive, it makes me possessive, it makes me needy and manipulative to get what I want. But luckily I've got some love in there, which is under the positive heading, and that's the part that's empathetic, that wants James to be happy, that causes me to be patient and kind. Theoretically. So when you see the relationships that don't work, that's because attachment runs the show, and in the moment attachment doesn't get what it wants, anger arises, and look at the relationships, look at the nightmares on this earth, But we've got our saving grace out and stuff, so your crucial job in my own mind, before I leave it to a relationship with James, is to start to recognise and distinguish between attachment and love. So when James is doing everything I want, of course I feel blissfully happy, and I definitely want him to be happy, which is called love. But if I stop it, if he stops doing what my attachment wants, guess what happens? My love goes down the toilet. Forget this, I'm angry with him, I chuck it out and get another version, So to learn to distinguish between attachment and love, for example, is a huge job. That really is a lot of internal work. Because they come together. They're like, they even look the same, they feel the same, but you can't distinguish. So that's the big part. Or to even distinguish between love, anger, and compassion, that's a very strong one. We have to see poor people suffering, we see poor animals first. We have compassion for them, but almost immediately we get angry at the person who caused it, and we often think it's righteous anger. Anger is fine, but often, we've got to really distinguish between the neurotic anger, which is I-based, and is completely neurotic, and exaggerates the badness, and makes a mess of the compassion. So I remember one time the Dalai Lama was asked, anger looks like it's a good policy when you're really trying to help others. He says, it's going to make you act. And he said, the Dalai Lama said, I know what you mean. But if it mainly comes from anger, it doesn't last. You give up your good work. But if it comes from compassion, you'll never give up. But also, I remember Martin Luther King saying, I think it's very profound. He said, it's okay to be angry, meaning to see there's fault out there. There's racism, there's sexism, there's suffering. You've got to see it. But instead of just raging on about it and getting angry, you then say, what can I do to help? That's compassion. So to distinguish between anger and compassion is a huge one. Attachment and love. Or even if you, in other words, all the delusions, all these neuroses, they're eye-based, they're distorted, they're fear-based, and they make a mess of our good stuff. And they make a mess of our relationships. So to know the difference between them, it takes a lot of inner work, a lot of real clarity in your own mind, So shall I start with prayer again? Shall I do that? Okay. So I'll sing two little prayers in Tibetan. And the first one is basically saying, I'm really very loose here, it's basically saying, here we've been for about an hour together, an hour and a quarter. And the Buddhist view would be as many thoughts as everyone's had, is as many seeds we each planted in our mind. It won't go astray. So we make this prayer sort of saying, okay, we make this aspiration to really, to never give up on ourselves, to recognise our potential and want to nourish these seeds so we can develop this life potential of ours, no matter how long it takes, so that we can be better for others, because we all live this world together, should we together. And the second little prayer is makes the aspiration, the compassion, grow in the heart's will.